Welcome back to the channel. It's time to talk about the worst comic book of the week, at least the one that Doc and I anticipated would be the worst. And Blade Vampire Nation #1 from Mark Russell and Dave Walker isn't the worst comic book I've ever read, but it doesn't feel like a Blade comic book. It feels like he had this story developed for another character, or maybe just any character, and then jammed Blade into it. And it turns out it's really, really boring, and it makes no sense for Blade, at least in my opinion. Here to talk to me about that is the Marvel aficionado himself. Doc, how you doing, Doc?
I'm good. Thank you for having me back. But once again, I hate you for making me read this.
This is really coming out of like a story from Avengers, maybe two and a half years ago, where Blade had been brought in. We had the Vampire Nation being brought up, and he was named like the sheriff of Vampiresque. It starts out somewhat exciting, Doc. And the art in here is actually really good. I love Dave Walker, and it looks really, really slick. We've got assassination attempt. We've got mercenaries, commandos going in to take out a vampire. They open it up. It's Corvus, so it starts out somewhat exciting. There's a little bit of action, and things are actually happening.
This is definitely probably the least terrible thing that Mark Russell's written. It's a great, kind of dropping you in right in the beginning, like kind of in the middle of the story. They actually did a pretty competent job of showing like this team going in. They're on a timer. You couldn't quite figure out if they were trying to take it or if they were trying
to extract, but then the helicopter gets shot down.
Yeah.
Go to plan B, which is to destroy the target. Pretty exciting opening to the comic book. I was like, hey, maybe there's something interesting to do here. But from then on, the comic book goes to complete shit because it's just about the inner workings and political machinations behind the vampire empire in Vampiresque and all this stuff in Chernobyl, and the stupid position that Blade has been put in as the sheriff of this nation. And he's actually going to go and investigate the assassination of this Corvus character for Dracula himself, which makes no sense whatsoever for the Blade character at all.
It seemed like a really cheap ploy that didn't really make sense. Hey, Mark Russell, let's show that you can write a police procedural. It's the vampire version of an episode of Law and Order SVU, trying to find every vampire that might have a problem with Dracula. It was a really poorly done procedural because it doesn't show his actual investigatory skills. All he does is just go ask random people, and it doesn't show how he gets drawn to the lady who it actually was.
That's true, but before then, he actually talks to the mayor of this city because he needs to get to the top, as you mentioned, and we end up learning that the Vampire Nation needs more immigrants. Wow, how timely for this to be shoved into a Blade vampire comic book. He explains that, humans could do one of three things. They can come here and be servants, or basically they can end up being a meal for the vampires themselves. But they have to turn a select few because we're running out of good vampires to run the nation. It was just like so shoehorned in here. It felt so out of place and so stupid.
So is Mark Russell advocating the great replacement theory? I'm really confused here. It's his commentary on immigration, replacing populations, and kind of a weirdly classist thing about, well, we need somebody to clean the gutters.
Quite frankly, it just kind of diverts you from the story that's being told, which isn't a real big problem because there's not a lot of action here whatsoever since the beginning of the story. He ends up meeting this lady who's kind of following around. It turns out there was a fifth mercenary that didn't die, and I guess the mercenaries have leverage on him because to do the job and to get paid or whatever, they also kidnap their families, and if they don't come back with the mission complete, they're going to murder them. But this lady's family is the one that's actually running the mercenary campaign, so they have no leverage, and due to quick thinking, she ends up being a maid or something like that to escape. And does she ever get out of the city, Doc? I'm not really sure. They just introduced her. They introduced some information. She says, I want to get out. And then they never revisit again.
Like, if your family owns the company, why in the hell are they sending you? You are wealthier. You don't need to go down and do that kind of stuff. And your kid definitely doesn't do it. All she is a plot device here.
To let you know that they weren't actually trying to kill Corvus. They were trying to kill Dracula, they thought.
You had plot devices to make plot devices to make plot devices work. And then you just ignored the plot device after that. So we don't know where the hell this chick ended up.
She did provide the exposition, which is basically what this comic book is about after about the first 5 or 6 pages. There is a vampire therapy group talking about what it's like to be changed. And there's one lady in there, the Contessa, and she's like, I remember when vampires were great. We used to run the city, we're wolves being thrown into a dog kennel here. And there's a young man that's like, I didn't even want to be a vampire. It's not cool. They just attacked me. And this old man's like, well, at least you were young when you became a vampire. I'm old. I have to look like this all the time. It's meant to show that vampires are just like you and me, and they need therapy, and they got all like these stupid little problems. But no one reads a Blade comic book for this kind of commentary on the vampire nation and culture. It's just really stupid.
We don't care as the readers. In fact, there's probably about 4 people on the planet that are really interested in that story. So good job, Mark. You wrote a story for them, but all this served as a way to have the Contessa's to establish her motivation, to have her out of her apartment so that later on we can find out Blade killed her bodyguards or whatever.
Servants or something.
Yeah.
And then he explains to her, it's not all the bodies, it's not the sunlight, it's not the this or that that's going to do you in if you're a vampire. It's the paperwork. Apparently he went and looked at the bank receipts and knew how much they paid the mercenaries because he talked to the daughter, and he figured out who transferred that amount of money that was an upper elite like vampire or whatever. And it is, in fact, the Contessa because she doesn't like Dracula and she wants to return things to the way they were. And they have a really boring conversation. Supposedly, he arrests her, right? And she ends up getting executed. We see none of that. Perhaps if he hadn't, I don't know, killed off the bodyguard and stuff before then, we could have actually had an action scene where he tries to apprehend her. Did she go in peacefully? I don't know, because once they're done establishing why she did it, the scene is over, and then he's on like talking to Dracula. There's no fucking action. There's like no finality to anything. It's just like drifts into the next scene.
If you want Blade to engage in any action in this story, you will be sorely disappointed because all he does is go around and talk to people. He suddenly became Lenny Briscoe from Law and Order.
But that's not the end, Doc. We get a really big reveal at the end. It turns out Dracula knew what Contessa was doing, and this was all a plan that he has used Blade in the process to take out one of his political rivals. In fact, he's the one that told the mercenaries where his body was supposed to be and sent Corvus there in the first place, essentially sacrificing one of his top lieutenants or whatever. And he opens the door, and the big surprise is the people really running the vampire nation aren't like his little elite group or cabal or whatever. It's actually a bunch of historical figures from back in the days. Like, wow, what amazing stuff.
Yeah, you look at it and you got George Washington, I think, and Henry Kissinger. That was definitely Kissinger. And it looked like Genghis Khan, but at the same time, I am really confused on how Genghis Khan is there because Dracula, in the same scene, he talks about how he had been turned 500 years ago. Genghis Khan was alive about 500 years before that. So I am really confused on how the fuck he's there.
Whatever, that was the big reveal. That's the payoff for 30 pages of fucking boring after a pretty hot start to this comic book.
And the fact is that it was just a one shot anyways. So you paid what, $5 for a 30-page one shot, a Blade, just to see Blade walk around and talk to people
and do things that Blade would never do within his character. He's not an actual ally of Dracula or the vampire nation. He should be opposing them. But here he's used as a pawn by Dracula. Somehow he doesn't see what's actually going on, and he just goes through with it and ends up getting one of his, chief political rivals in the vampire nation murdered in the process.
They, at no point did they ever actually establish motivation for Blade to be interested enough to go and engage in this. He could have just said, nah, man, I really don't care. I ain't gonna bother. I don't care.
He even has like a badge that he throws up like he's the real sheriff or something. It was like kind of embarrassing stuff. I felt bad for Blade, but we're not going to see the character very often. It's basically just going to be his daughter, Bloodline. I think that's what her name is. That's the only Blade-like character we'll be seeing for a few years, at least in the Marvel comic book universe.
While it was probably the best thing Mark Russell's ever written, it was still shit.
This is not the first time Doc and I have covered a Blade comic book, a recent Blade comic book on Worst of the Week. We actually talked about Bloodline and some other stuff. I think it was Danny Lore writing this. Definitely check this out. This was a really bad comic book. Definitely worse than what Mark Russell put out this week. If you don't see it here, there's also a link in the video description.